The Quantum Experiment, When Reality Bends. The laboratory was dimly lit, the fluorescent lighting casting an eerie glow upon the concrete walls. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals, and the sound of bubbling liquids filled the room. Scientists in white coats hurried around, their faces lined with concentration as they tended to their experiments. In the center of the room stood a massive machine, its sleek metal exterior gleaming in the low light. Dr. Allison Miller stood at a desk, poring over notes as she prepared to start the experiment. This was the moment she had been working towards for years, and she could hardly contain her excitement. She had spent countless hours perfecting the machine, fine-tuning every component until it was ready for its first trial. A nervous energy coursed through her as she made her final preparations. She checked and rechecked the settings on the machine, going over every detail with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. Everything had to be perfect. The outcome of this experiment could change the course of history. Her assistant, John, stood awkwardly in the corner of the room, watching her with apprehension. He had seen the look on her face before, the one that told him she was about to take an enormous risk. He knew he couldn't dissuade her, not when she was this close to success, but he couldn't help feeling uneasy about the whole thing. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked hesitantly. Dr. Miller didn't even look up from her notes. "Of course it is," she replied briskly. "We've gone over the calculations 100 times. There's no reason it shouldn't work." John bit his lip, but he knew that arguing with her would be pointless. With a deep breath, he stepped forward to help her set up the final components of the machine. It was time to begin. Dr. Miller took her place at the console, her fingers poised over the keys. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves, and then tapped the enter key. The machine whirred to life, its components humming in unison. The lights flickered, and the room shook as the machine built up to full power. For a moment, everything went still. Dr. Miller held her breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, with a suddenness that took her breath away, the machine exploded into action. Bright flashes of light filled the room, and a high-pitched whine filled their ears. John cried out, stumbling backwards as the energy from the machine washed over him. Dr. Miller hung on, her fingers still pressed to the console as she watched the events unfold. The room seemed to warp and twist around her, and she could feel the ground shaking beneath her feet. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The lights flickered and then stabilized, and the machine went silent. Dr. Miller took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Had it worked? She looked around the room, taking in the stunned expressions of the other scientists. And then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A strange mist had begun to fill the room, quickly obscuring everything in sight. It was coming from the machine, spreading outwards in all directions. Dr. Miller felt her throat go dry as she realized what had happened. They had created something they couldn't control. Panic set in as everyone in the room began to run for the exits, trying to escape the rapidly spreading mist. Dr. Miller stayed rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the machine. She had to shut it down before it was too late. With trembling fingers, she tapped a few keys on the console, but nothing happened. The machine was unresponsive, locked in some kind of loop. She tried again, but still, nothing. The mist was getting thicker, and it was starting to play tricks on her senses. She could hear things moving in the shadows, and feel cold fingers brushing against her skin. She had to get out of there. With one final effort, she threw all her weight against the console, trying to force it to shut down. And then, with a deafening roar, the machine exploded. Dr. Miller was thrown to the ground, the force of the explosion knocking the breath from her lungs. She lay there for a moment, stunned, as the mist closed in on her. She knew what was coming. And then it hit her. The mist was alive. It was sentient. And it was hungry. Dr. Allison Miller woke up to a world that was completely unfamiliar. It was dimly lit, and the air was thick with a strange mist that seemed to cling to her skin. She looked around, taking in the alien landscape that surrounded her. Everything was different from what she knew, and yet it all seemed achingly familiar. She stumbled to her feet, the ground shifting and rolling beneath her. Her head was pounding, and she could feel the strange mist working its way into her lungs. She knew she had to keep moving, had to find some way out of this bizarre new world she had found herself trapped in. As she walked, she began to notice strange figures lurking in the shadows. They were tall, gaunt, and seemed to be made entirely of shadows themselves. They moved with an otherworldly grace, and as she watched, she realized they were hunting her. She broke into a run, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter how fast she went, the shadow creatures kept up with her, their touch icy and deadly. It was only when she stumbled across the ruins of what looked like an ancient city that she found a moment's reprieve. She ducked into the crumbling remains of a building, huddled in one of the corners and tried her best to stay still and silent. She could hear them prowling outside, and it was only by sheer force of will that she kept from screaming. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadow creatures disappeared into the mist. Dr. Miller remained huddled there, trying to make sense of what had just happened to her. As best she could tell, she had somehow been transported to an alternate reality, one that was filled with horrors she could hardly comprehend. She spent what felt like days wandering through the ruins of the ancient city, encountering all manner of strange and terrifying creatures. She saw landscapes that defied explanation, and structures that seemed to be alive, pulsing with a sickly energy. It was only when she met another human that she began to regain some sense of hope. His name was Dr. Jacob Barlow, and he too had been unknowingly trapped in this strange, alien dimension. Together, they began to explore the world they had found themselves in. They found that it was a fragile and ever-shifting thing, existing somewhere between reality and the darkest corners of the human mind. They encountered strange beings that they couldn't begin to name, fought twisted monsters, and even found themselves confronting versions of themselves from alternate timelines. But through it all, they never lost hope. And then, when they had been exploring for what felt like weeks, they came across something even more terrifying than anything they had faced before. It was a rift in reality, a place where the two worlds they had been caught between seemed to overlap. Dr. Miller and Dr. Barlow knew they had to find a way back to their own reality, no matter how impossible it seemed. But as they peered into the writhing, pulsing rift, they knew that they would be changed forever by the journey back. With a deep breath, they stepped through the rift, and felt the weight of reality settle around them once more. But they knew that they were not unchanged, that they would carry the memories of that other world with them always. As they stumbled out of the ruins of the ancient city, they emerged into a world vastly different than the one they had left behind. But they were both still alive, they still had hope, and they knew that they would never forget the horrors they had encountered in that other reality. Dr. Miller and Dr. Barlow emerged from the rift into a world that was familiar and yet somehow different. The sky was bluer, the air fresher, and the grass greener. But there was an undercurrent of something dark and foreboding, something that suggested that their journey through the rift had left a mark on them. As they walked, they noticed that they were different somehow. They felt stronger, more powerful, as if the journey had unlocked some latent potential within them. And as they walked, they began to realize that they had acquired strange new abilities. Dr. Miller could feel the energy coursing through her veins, and as she concentrated, she felt her body transform. Her skin became impenetrable, and her limbs stretched outwards until she towered over Dr. Barlow. Dr. Barlow, for his part, found that he could control the very fabric of reality itself. As he focused his mind, he could manipulate matter and energy on a molecular level, forcing objects to move and bend to his will. They realized that they had returned from the other reality with abilities beyond their wildest dreams. And as they explored their newfound powers, they began to realize that they could change the world. They started using experiments to test the limits of their new abilities. Dr. Miller's strength was tested when she was able to lift massive rocks and boulders, and even throw them with ease. Dr. Barlow's powers were tested when he was able to control the temperature of objects, turning ice into fire, and fire into ice. As they continued to experiment with their powers, they discovered that they could do even more than they had ever imagined. They could fly, create shields, and control the elements themselves. They were no longer mere mortals, but beings of immense power. But with greater power came greater responsibility. They realized that they could no longer just be scientists conducting experiments. They had to use their abilities to protect the world. And then, they discovered that they were not the only ones with these powers. They began to encounter other beings, individuals who had been affected in similar ways by the rift. Some were benevolent, using their powers for good, while others were corrupted by their newfound abilities. As they fought these beings, they realized that there were those who would use their powers for evil. They could not let that happen. They had to form an alliance, a team of heroes who would use their powers to protect the innocent and bring stability to a world that was increasingly unstable. And so, they formed the Guardians, a group of individuals who had been changed by the rift, and who had committed themselves to using their powers for the greater good. They waged war against supervillains who threatened the safety of the world, and fought to restore balance to a reality that had been irrevocably changed by their journey through the rift. But as they looked back on everything they had been through, they couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if they had never encountered the other reality. They would never have discovered their powers, they would never have formed the Guardians, and they would never have known the true extent of what they were capable of. But they did encounter the other reality, and they emerged from it with a power that would change everything. They would have to live with the consequences of their journey for the rest of their lives, but they knew that they had become something greater than themselves. They had become superheroes. As the Guardians continued to fight supervillains and protect the world, Dr. Miller began to notice that something was wrong with her. The power she had gained from the other reality was beginning to have a strange effect on her mind. She became obsessed with testing the limits of her powers, pushing herself to the brink of exhaustion as she experimented with every conceivable use of her abilities. At first, no one noticed anything wrong, as she continued to perform heroic acts alongside her teammates. But the truth was that Dr. Miller was slowly descending into madness. She would stay up for days at a time, performing experiments without food or rest. She stopped communicating with her teammates, and was often seen talking to herself in empty rooms. She became increasingly detached from reality, convinced that she was the only one who truly understood the power they possessed. And then, one day, she vanished. The Guardians searched high and low for her, but she seemed to have vanished into thin air. They had no idea where she could have gone, or what could have driven her to leave without a word. It wasn't until they received a message from her, delivered by one of her old assistants, that they began to understand the depth of her descent into madness. The message was a manifesto, a declaration of Dr. Miller's intent to use her powers to remake the world in her own image. She believed that she had unlocked the secret to ultimate power, and that she alone was worthy of wielding it. The Guardians were horrified, realizing that they had been fighting a battle not just against supervillains, but against one of their own. They knew that they had to stop her, no matter the cost. They tracked Dr. Miller to a secret facility where she had been conducting disturbing experiments on unsuspecting subjects. They stormed the facility, confronting Dr. Miller in a final showdown. It was a grueling fight, with Dr. Miller using all of her abilities to hold off her former teammates. But in the end, a combination of their powers and teamwork allowed the Guardians to overpower her. Dr. Miller was brought before a tribunal of the world's leaders, where she was deemed too dangerous to be allowed to roam free. She was imprisoned in a high-security facility, far away from any chance of causing harm. The Guardians were left to grapple with the fallout of what had happened. They realized that their powers came with a great price, and that they had to be responsible in how they used them. They had to keep each other in check, to ensure that none of them would fall prey to the same kind of madness that had consumed Dr. Miller. They knew that they still had a lot to learn, and that they had to continue to work together to protect the world. But they also knew that, in the end, their greatest battle might be against themselves. They had gained immense power, but they also knew how easily that power could corrupt them. As the Guardians continued to work together, they began to uncover a series of strange occurrences and a pattern of events that were far beyond anything they had ever encountered before. They realized that they were dealing with something much bigger than themselves, something that threatened not just their world, but the fabric of reality itself. They pored over data and studied strange artifacts, trying to piece together the clues that hinted at the true nature of this unknown threat. And then, one day, they discovered something that would change everything. It was a series of ancient texts, written in an unknown language that seemed to defy all attempts at translation. But as they studied the texts, they began to realize that it contained something incredibly powerful, something that could hold the key to unlocking the true nature of their reality. Over the course of several months, they worked tirelessly to decipher the texts, poring over every word and letter in search of any possible clue. And then, one day, something miraculous happened. The words began to shift and change before their eyes. No longer a series of incomprehensible characters, but a series of symbols that seemed to resonate within their very souls. Suddenly, the true meaning of the texts was revealed to them. They had discovered that the universe as they knew it was not the only one, but rather one of an infinite number of parallel realities, each slightly different from the next. They learned that these realities existed in a delicate balance, and that any interference could lead to disastrous consequences. But despite their best efforts, the balance between reality and unreality had been broken, and something terrifying was on the horizon. Something was trying to merge all of the realities into one, with disastrous results. The Guardians knew that they had to act fast, that they had to prevent the cataclysmic merging of realities before it was too late. And so, they made a plan, a daring expedition that would take them to the heart of the merging. They traveled through the infinite number of realities, encountering endless variations of themselves and their colleagues. They fought countless battles along the way, battling to stay alive and preserve the balance between realities. And then, they encountered the source of the merging, a being of such immense power that they could barely comprehend it. But they refused to back down, fighting with everything they had in one final battle for the fate of their reality. The battle was long and grueling, but in the end, the Guardians emerged victorious. They had prevented the merging, and restored balance to the universe. But for all their efforts, they knew that they could never let their guard down, for there would always be those who would try to upset the delicate balance of reality. As they looked out over the infinite number of realities that stretch out before them, they knew that the fight would never truly be over. But as they looked back on everything that they had accomplished, they knew that they had become something truly great, something that had transcended mortal limits. They had become the guardians of reality itself. It had been several years since the Guardians had saved the universe from total collapse. They had continued to fight against powerful villains, protect the innocent, and keep the balance in check. However, they knew that a storm was brewing on the horizon. They could feel it in their bones, and they knew that this time, the stakes were much higher. The villain they were facing was known only as the Unmaker, a being so powerful that it could destroy entire realities with a mere thought. The Guardians knew that, with their newfound abilities, they were the universe's last line of defense against this terrible foe. The Unmaker had begun an intense campaign to merge all of the realities once more, but this time, he had learned from his previous attempts. He had enlisted the aid of several extremely dangerous villains, each with their own powers that complemented his abilities. They had formed an alliance so powerful that anyone they faced was defeated without any effort. The Guardians realized that if they were to defeat the Unmaker and his minions, they would have to work together like never before. They formed battle plans, discussed tactics, and practiced in secret until the day of battle arrived. The sky was dark, and the wind seemed to whisper of impending doom as they approached the battleground. The Guardians could see their enemies, silhouetted against the darkening sky, waiting for them. And then, the battle began. It was fierce and unrelenting. The Guardians fought with everything they had, but they quickly realized that their opponents were too powerful to defeat without working together as a team. They called out to each other, using their powers for maximum effect, and trusting their teammates to watch their backs. Dr. Miller fought alongside Dr. Barlow, each using their powers to protect the other while unleashing devastating attacks on their foes. The sonic screams they created stunned their enemies, while their powerful punches and kicks broke bones and shattered armor. At the same time, Jack Frost and Firebird fought together, controlling ice and fire with incredible precision. Their opponents could hardly keep up with their ever-changing attacks, and those who tried to do so got burnt, froze, or both. Saturn's rings and the Earthshaker fought with the power of gravity and Earth itself. They created pits and caused their opponents to float uncontrollably, making them easy targets for their teammates. The battle raged on for what seemed like an eternity. Nobody could gain the upper hand, and as the Guardians started to lose hope, the Unmaker revealed his true terrifying form. A giant monster made of pure darkness towered over them, crushing everything beneath its feet. It was a creature of such immense power that the Guardians were almost paralyzed with fear. But then, they saw something that filled them with hope. They saw that, like them, each one of their teammates was fighting back against the darkness. They saw that they were strong, and that they were worthy of their powers. Working together, they launched a final, decisive assault on the Unmaker, using all of their powers in concert. Dr. Miller and Dr. Barlow combined their strength to land a thunderous blow that rocked the creature, while Jack Frost and Firebird created a powerful tornado of ice and flames that battered its form into submission. Saturn's rings and the Earthshaker created an enormous pulse of gravitational energy that crushed the creature in a singularity, pulling it apart at the molecular level. The Unmaker was no more. The Guardians had achieved victory, but they knew that they could never let their guard down. There would always be threats to the universe and to the balance of reality, but as long as they had each other and their powers, they knew that they could defend against anything. They looked up at the sky, now lightened and peaceful, and knew that their fight for good would continue on forever. They were the Guardians, protectors of the universe, and they would always be ready for the next battle. The battle against the Unmaker had been a turning point for the Guardians. They had faced the greatest threat to their universe and emerged victorious. They had only become stronger as a team, and they had learned what it meant to truly rely on one another. As they stood on the battlefield, exhausted but elated, they looked up at the sky and felt a sense of calm. For the first time in a long time, they felt like they could breathe, like they could finally rest. But as the days passed, they realized that they could not stay in this state of rest forever. They had a responsibility, a duty to protect their world and keep it safe from all threats. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, they set out to continue their mission. But this time, they knew that things would be different. They had faced their greatest enemy and had emerged stronger because of it. They had learned the true value of teamwork and had seen what they were capable of when they worked together. They also knew that there would always be threats to the universe, and that they could not do it alone. They began to reach out to some of the other extraordinary beings around the world, offering them guidance, training, and leadership. They built up a coalition of heroes, each with their unique abilities and skills. Together, they formed a new organization, one that would work tirelessly to protect the universe from harm. They called it the Infinity Corps, and it signaled a new era of cooperation and teamwork in the battle for good. The Infinity Corps spread out across the world, helping those in need, and fighting against evil at every turn. They got stronger, more organized, and more effective with every passing day. And as they continued to fight, they realized that they were not alone. Other beings and organizations around the world, both good and bad, had taken notice of them. Some feared them, while others respected them. But they knew that they had to keep working, to keep protecting the universe, no matter what. They never forgot their ultimate goal: to preserve the balance of reality and to ensure that the universe could flourish for generations to come. As time passed, the Guardians became a legend, a symbol of hope for the future. They had saved the universe from destruction, and in doing so, they had earned the admiration of millions. But they also knew that they could never rest. There would always be someone out there, trying to destroy everything they had worked so hard to protect. So, they continued to protect the world. They continued to fight against evil, and they continued to inspire others to take up the fight alongside them. The Guardians knew that the universe was vast and that there was still so much to explore and discover, but they were confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would be ready to face them. They had faced the worst the universe had to offer and emerged stronger than ever before. They were the Guardians, defenders of the universe, and their mission to protect it would never end. For them, this was not the end, but a new beginning.